Okay, well, welcome everybody. And this presentation today is brought to you by TVision and Realeyes. This is the CMO guide for leveraging creative attention for TV attention performance. We're going to dive in, but we've also got a quick Super Bowl tease at the end. We'll talk more about that after we get through our main work. I'm Max at Realeyes, work in marketing and growth and product strategy at Realeyes, and my partner Tristan today, who I worked on with this in this project. And hello, Tristan.
Hi, everybody. Excited to share the work that we've done. So looking forward to the session together.
So a couple of things, remember this. First foremost is what we did together with TVision Realeyes, we believe was the first of its kind. So we put together, fused creative attention data, pre-test environment with in-market creative attention data. And this is the first time this has been done as far as we know. And so it was really almost an exploratory project together to see where the magic happens and to pull out new and innovative use cases for attention data, both on creative pre-market and in-market. The second big thing comes out is a low-performing creative can do a lot better in premium environments. And in fact, lower creative can have better gains in more premium environments than very high-scoring creative. So it gives some things to think about when you're matching your creative with your media. Thirdly, we found that low-performing or low-scoring creative doesn't have to be thrown away necessarily, but that repeat exposure can allow a lower-performing creative to sort of come to life. Just some frequency. So that was something we'll go into. And then finally, just to underscore that you can't figure any of this out without testing periodically and understanding the shifts, the fluid nature of people's response to creative and how it performs in market. So start off, we have sort of a little bit of a heavy chart here, but I'll explain it. It's pretty simple once you understand what's in it. What we did is we tested close to 50 ads in a few key categories. So consumer tech, CPG, and streaming entertainment technology. And so what we did is we looked at correlations between Realeyes' core scores on creative, which happens typically before an ad flights in media. And then we looked at TVision creative attention score, which is basically looks at how well an ad breaks out within a pod on average over the course of its history. And we also looked at TVision's creative attention breakout score for the first impression. Typically, creatives will have a slightly different, more intense score the first time that they're viewed by somebody. The key thing to look here is that we saw some real correlations across the different scores. Realeyes' top creative score is called the quality score. And that captures the ability of an ad to capture attention, to retain attention, and to encode the brain with an emotional response in the human or in the audience member. And the key thing that we see here is that there is a reasonable correlation between pre-market creative quality scores and what actually happens in market. And if you see, we're looking at correlation of 0.3, in some cases up to almost 0.7. We think those are pretty meaningful, especially considering all the variables and factors which could promote or impede a creative from performing once in market. All the sort of environmental factors that could shift things around. Anyone with an eagle eye might notice that there's some sort of yellow shaded box with a negative correlation in the CPG. And that was really an anomaly. And one of the rules of creative is that every creative rule is made to be broken. And there was actually one particular outlier ad in that set, which was really a sort of a strange sort of phenomenon, which kind of really kind of weighed down the group of creatives in that section. But if you took that out, we could have taken it out and had a really clean correlation, but we decided to leave it in because it's what really happened. But anyway, the point here is that there are real correlations. Now we'll start to go into what they mean. So media placement impacts attention to ads. So Tristan, why don't you take us through this?
Yeah. So one of the things that really jumped out of the work that we did was that yes, there is a connection between engagement that we observe for an ad pre-test versus when it's observed in market. But then the other piece is that given that, is the success of that ad kind of like predetermined? Does that mean, a bad ad can't perform well? A good ad is destined for success? And what we were able to observe and really saw as we started to dig into some of the drivers of differences in behavior over time was that really media placement has a huge role to play. So as you can see here, depending on the day part, there are really meaningful differences in the level of attention that one can expect to be paid to an ad. For example, overnight versus prime time or early morning viewing, you would expect to have very different results in terms of the same ad delivered to the same people just based on time of day. This to me is an important thing to remember, that you still have tools in your toolbox, even if you find that an ad is high performing or low performing, to set it up for success. That goes even further. You can see here, you can drill this down to the program level. And this is really something that we do at TVision to work with our brand partners to try and put together media plans that will help to drive the greatest possible outcomes for their campaign. And as you can see here, that not all programming settings, the context in which the ad is delivered, not just the time of day. When I talk about time of day, I often talk about like the rhythm of the day, the ability to give your attention is very different when you're getting the kids ready for school versus after they're settled down for bed, at least in my case anyway. In addition to time of day, the programming context really matters. So you can see here two very different programs. Even given the best creative, it's very, very difficult to expect an ad that's placed at the lower left here from a programming context to break through and really deliver a great ad experience. The next thing was really trying to put all of this together and for us try and unpack some of the learnings that were coming through. So one of the things that you might have noticed in the earlier correlation slide was that the correlation weakens beyond the first impression between the pre-testing and what's observed in market. What that tells us is that context now starts to play a bigger role with repeated exposure. You've got more confounding factors beyond just the creative itself. One of those factors that we talked about before was day part. And so what we actually did here is we took the creatives that we observed and we split them into two groups: the high performing creatives, the ones that tested really well in the pre-testing, and the low performing creatives that did not break through in the same way. And what we see is actually really interesting. It's that the high performing creatives have a lot less variance in terms of their performance across the day. So if you've got a good ad, if you place it well, great, it's likely to get a boost, but ultimately it is less affected by placement in terms of its ability to break through the pod and deliver attention. When we look at a low performing creative, you can see that the variance in performance across the day is more significant. You see those bigger swings, multiple percentage points in most cases. In that scenario, what we're really observing here is that these lower performing creatives rely on good placement in order to break through and have higher levels of attention. So it's somewhat counterintuitive here. You would think, take your best creative, put it in the best positioning, and it might have a bit of a multiplier effect. And it will. But it also, the other way to think about this is you can use that good creative to break through in places where you just can't break through otherwise. And if you have some creative that didn't test as well, you might want to put more effort into the media placement decisions to ensure that it's set up with its best possible chance at success. Now, the other thing that was really interesting here was essentially a negative correlation between exposure and attention for high performing ads. So the more people saw the ads that tested really well and did well on their first exposure, as we saw, we actually tended to see that the level of creative attention decreased over time. So flashy ads, they get your attention first time you see them. Perhaps they do not have the ability to continue to have the same impact over time. On the flip side, when we look at the lower performing ads, we see actually quite the opposite. While these started out testing and being measured from an attention standpoint a little bit lower, over time with repeated exposure, we actually see attention to these ads build. I think there's definitely more research and exploration to go into this area. But what we believe we're seeing here is, the effect where an ad that perhaps doesn't rely on as many, I'm not going to say tricks, but, features that will drive attention, perhaps is less reliant on those on an ongoing basis and has more opportunity to build familiarity over time. So just interesting to think that there can be a life for these lower performing ads. It requires monitoring. You need to keep an eye on how they're going over time, but it also requires thought in terms of where you place these ads and make sure that they're best positioned to break through and deliver the kind of impact that they need to do.
So next, we're going to take a look at an example ad here. So we're going to play it, and it's going to sort of render in real time a little bit how the creative attention measurement works in the background. But I will play this.
Galaxy S21.
This looks different.
It is.
Show me.
Just hit record. See that? You're filming in 8K. That's cinema quality.
So
You can pull photos straight from video.
impressive. But will it last the whole trip?
You'll have battery all day. And then more.
This is different.
Told you.
Basically, you saw sort of an action, capturing attention, retaining attention, and then encoding the brain. And the capture performed not so well, which means there was a distraction pretty early on compared to other ads in this competitor set. Retain, the amount of attentive audience tended to be much less than the median, and then the encoding score was a little bit better than average. So all in all, a quality score of 4. The 3 subscores culminate together. So kind of a middle level ad, not slightly below average. Anyway, that was this ad, and then we'll go into where that factors. So here we have the actual attention volume over time, second by second. And so the point here is that you'll see these peaks and troughs based on key moments within the ad, and that's something we often use diagnosis that we give on an individual ad to improve or edit, turn lower or middle performing ads into better performing ads. Key point here is, which Tristan's going to go into, is that even a middle score doesn't mean that you can't make great success. If that's the asset that you have to work with, there's media strategies that you can follow to make the best of that asset, even though it may not be your best performing asset on attention scores on the creative.
Yeah, so what we did here is we really revisited some of those earlier slides where we looked at those overall trends in terms of opportunities to drive performance beyond just the creative itself. And so what we actually saw with this particular ad is that each dot here represents a programming selection for the campaign. Basically, the bigger the circle, the more volume was put behind that particular placement. And what you can see, if you remember, we had quite a nice drawn out line in the earlier slide with a distribution of potential outcomes. With this particular campaign, it ran heavily in high performing ads, ad environments. So above average viewability, which means people are more likely to be in the room, above average attention, which means people are spending more time with eyes on screen than other ads. You can see that despite the fact that the ad did not test all that well, the media was able to put it to work in environments where it gave it the best possible chance of success. And we really dug into this ad because it was a puzzle for us. It was one where it tested well, it tested so-so, but it performed quite well in market. So we wanted to unpack and understand why. If we move on to the next slide, when we look at placements across the day, you can see that this ad had a major skew towards the prime windows. So 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. placement is where most of those ads were run. So again, it was set up in a way that gave it the best possible chance to succeed and break through from an attention standpoint. And then similarly to the trend that we observed earlier, despite not testing well and the first exposure being middle of the road, 100 being the norm within our data set, you can see that this ad did in fact build on the audience, and that with repeated exposure, attention increased for this ad. So what we have here is sort of like a perfect kind of case study example of what was observed in the low performing bucket earlier, but it was able to perform well enough consistently that ultimately, when we look at the aggregate scores over the course of the campaign, this ad actually did very well. Just because the ad does not test well the first time, it doesn't mean that it has no chance of success. It just requires more stewardship in terms of the way that the campaign is executed.
So thank you, Tristan. And if any questions, feel free to put them in the chat and they'll try to address them. I mentioned we had some Super Bowl pregame data. So this is going to be released later today. What we have is the creative attention scores, the pre-released ads, and the total ads for 2020, 2021. And then we looked at the early ads for 2022. The trend that we see, and focus on the quality score, which is the left-hand column first, is that in 2020, you had the early released ads score quite a bit higher than the remainder of the full ads that happened. And then a similar phenomena happened in 2021, where the early ads achieved attention at a rate than the overall ads. So, what this kind of tells us is that the early releasers tend to be, I think, probably a little bit more confident that they're putting out something that's very high quality, and they're probably brands that spent a little bit more time orchestrating and planning up for this versus just creating a single ad that they just air, during the regular game. So they seem to be taking advantage of tension and the anticipation that comes in that window before the game. But the fact that you had the early game ads, sort of a slightly higher score than the overall ads for the past 2 years, we thought was interesting. And we saw, a somewhat consistent proximity in the scores as well. So a little bit over what the overall set would look like for the past 2 years. So based off of that, we're going out with a prediction this year that the ads are going to be extraordinarily better when it comes to capturing attention, retaining attention, and driving response. And so the early release ads of this year registered at 5.7 out of a possible 10. The overall set follows a similar trend as last year. They'll probably on average score a little bit lower than the early release ads, but our estimate, this is purely prediction, but our estimate is going to be around 5.0 to 5.2 out of a possible 10. And the big thing that's really driving that is the encoding score, which is Realeyes' method for detecting an emotional response while a viewer is paying attention. So the early release ads radically, really skyrocket compared to prior, where we're seeing levels in 90, and that's out of 100. So that's really an index. So 90 out of 100. So huge use of emotion in these ads versus prior, and that's really what's driving that change. We're not going to go into a diagnosis of the individual ads here, but what I can say after viewing the early released ads, they tend to inject a lot more humor than we've seen in some years. A lot more confidence about returning to sort of regular post-pandemic life, a lot fewer uses of masks. So we think that our way we would explain this is that the creatives at the brands are getting back into sort of celebrating life and being a little bit bolder and more confident, and sort of getting out of the more repressed, somber mode that advertising has taken in the past couple of years. So the final thing I want to say about this is that good advertising can equal better media outcomes. And if you have a creative where the audience will pay attention, that's a good thing, versus if they decrease their attention. And so we actually go through, we have an algorithm which translates the creative attention and adjusts a CPM based on the ability to capture and retain attention and encode the brain. So if somebody, theoretically were to watch your creative for half the time, that CPM, theoretically might get more expensive when you think about the actual cost for a quality exposure. So We believe that this year, the Super Bowl advertisers, higher quality creative is going to have an economic benefit, which is a lower cost of quality exposures in the end. And then we'll be working with TVision after the fact to take a look and see if that hypothesis might be true. And Tristan and Jermaine, if you're on the call, I don't know if you put in the chat yet, but we have, I believe you all have a link to a session where you're going to be releasing some of this data and feeding some of the Realeyes data as well.
Yeah,
So,
that's right. So we'll be doing another session next Thursday. So the team's going to be heads down late night Sunday and into the early hours of the week, putting together our look back over the Super Bowl. I agree with your assessment. I mean, the last 2 years it's been hard to inject too much joy into the commercials and trying to connect with people in a world that has not been all that connected has been a challenging thing. So I think it's been really nice, like looking through the ads that are coming out to see much more positive, much more optimistic sort of look at the world moving forward. So I'm excited to see how the session how the game goes, but also how the ads perform. And so, yeah, looking forward to reconnecting with folks in a week.
Well, Tristan, one quick question. Maybe if you could share some light around what you're seeing with clients, if you see any change or behavioral change with either the marketers or the agencies and how they're coordinating the creative and the media. From Realeyes perspective, I think we might see more orchestration happening in digital, on a more optimization going on, pulling levers of creative and media. But what are you seeing, or what's the trend with some of the advertisers who are still investing a lot in the conventional linear TV?
Yeah, I think the challenge with TV has always been, the commitments that you make are made so far ahead that a lot of people look at the media plan as somewhat of a fixed entity. I think there's two elements that we observe. One is much more active tracking of ongoing creative performance, recognizing that of the levers that you have to pull after making a media commitment, your creative really is one of those ones that you have in your hand, up till the very last minute to switch out creative. So tracking and cycling creative based on in-market performance is definitely something that we're seeing our brands doing. I think the other thing is just thinking about kind of the swim lanes for different creative. And I think this works more for multi-brand advertisers, but a lot of the time, they're purchasing across multiple brands up front. And the big opportunity there is to start realizing and recognizing that there are certain environments that are really advantageous for certain brands or campaigns. The underlying trend there is really recognizing what levers do I have to pull even beyond the big upfront commitment, because there's value to be unlocked in that big negotiation every year, and we work hard to help people do that. But I think the most important thing is to realize, like, the marketer's job is not done at that point. There's a lot of opportunity across the rest of the year to drive performance.
So we'll finish up with one last slide here. You got to understand your creative strengths and weaknesses. As Tristan noting, just the TV buy is often made so far in advance that the creative is a lever that you can. But you need to think of the strengths and weaknesses as in context of the media. Make the most of the media based on your creative, and it sounds simple, although we don't always see that happening in practice. The two functions need to be working together, and we believe that attention is the bridge between creative and media. It's a common KPI that both can work toward for a better outcome. Third is obviously monitor your attention and frequency. Tristan introduced where in and where out, how to media strategies for optimizing creative that might score better or lower. You've got the assets that you have to make them work. So there's techniques with your media that can make your different qualities of creative have the best chance of succeeding. And then again, you have to test periodically. So sentiment, something changes, environments change. So it's an always on mentality around collecting the data to inform your decisioning is key. With that, I want to thank everybody for joining, and thank you, Tristan and the TVision crew. The link to the post-Super Bowl analysis is in the chat, and we'll also send around a recording and the assets from the presentation as well. All right, everyone, cheers. Have a good week.
Thanks, everyone.